In one generation, China has taken Africa by storm, going all in on everything from big infrastructure projects, mining and agriculture, to the sale of medicine and clothing. At a time when superpower tensions are now spiking, the accusations of corruption of African elites and unscrupulous deals that catch nations on the continent in a debt trap somehow are ringing louder. Beijing's defenders counter that despite the debt relief of 2 decades ago, former colonial powers like France, Britain, Portugal are hardly in any position to criticize. Of course, the truth is more nuanced. France 24 went to Zambia to meet some of the 1 million plus Chinese who've left their homes to make a new life on the other side of the world. We'll hear from them and from the locals who are of two minds as to what many describe as a whole new world order in that resource-rich former British colony. The full documentary is called Zambia Under Chinese Influence. Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about it. France 24 reporter Nicolas Germain, part of the team that went. Thanks for being with us.
Hi.
Also with us from Lusaka, Grieve Chelwa, scholar at the New School for Social Research's Institute on Race and Political Economy. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Solange Guyot-Chatelain is China-Africa researcher at the Université Libre de Brussels, Brussels Free University. Welcome back to the show, Solange.
Hi, good evening.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. So Nicolas, along with France 24's Romeo Langlois and Yi Song, taking the time to speak with high-ups, but also ordinary Chinese who've made a new life far from their homeland.
你在中国的话，搞农业没有大地块让你去做农业了，所以说你必须从国内走出来，国内也是要求我们走出来，什么办法呀？因为中国的话，地块太小了，人口太多了，
主要竞争太激烈了。比如说一个火龙果一样，你在国内，可能你家种了，看到你赚钱了，明天他就跟上了，对不对？ 在这边的话，就是我独家。你像我这么一个农场，就我一个人在这里，用的全部当地工人。
互惠互利嘛，双赢嘛。我们需要他们，他们也需要我们。因为他们的基督国家嘛，他们可能觉得我们是上帝派来的，真的。 他说他们感谢 God 嘛，我们是上帝派来的人呢，我们是上帝派来的人。
Nicolas Germain, what is the relationship when this was what near Lusaka?
Yes,
near the capital. What is the relationship between those employers and their employees?
Well, generally speaking, what the Zambians told us is that they don't mind if the Chinese bring in like new technology, new machines to Zambia, but they don't like it so much if they start selling chickens, something in which many Zambians.
We'll show an excerpt of that. Yeah. In this particular case, here you have one of the men saying, "I'm the only Chinese person here, and everybody else here around me is Zambian." Describe a bit more what
So he was producing dragon fruit, and indeed, when we went to his farm, he was the only Chinese person there, and all his employees were Zambians. Interestingly, he'd just come from many years in Angola, where he was in the textile industry, and it wasn't working there anymore in Angola, so he decided to go to Zambia to produce dragon fruit. So it's still saying in Africa. And actually, at the end of the film, he tells us that he's been in Africa now for 12 years, and he never wants to go back to China.
Never wants to go back, didn't feel homesick.
No, a lot of these Chinese people, they tell us that in China it's too crowded, too polluted, and they really much prefer their lives in Africa or in Zambia.
Solange Guyot-Chatelain, your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think we have to put it in a wider context, really. Of China is becoming rich as a country, but what is often missed out in the big China superpower story are huge amounts of the population who have been kind of left behind, if you like, or are not benefiting from opening and reform and the marketization of Chinese society. And these people have seen their hopes and their expectations of a better life, have been stirred in them, and people want to have a better life. But for the average ordinary Chinese person, particularly those with low, modest social and economic capital to begin with, it's very, very, very hard. And so what they see really in the opportunity of leaving China and going to places like Zambia, which you would not imagine that it would be kind of, on the top of their list. Where do you go? You're from one of the biggest and most powerful countries in the world, and yet you want to leave this country and you want to go to a place like Zambia, which is one of the poorest countries in the world. There's a puzzle there, and that has to be explained. And part of that is that there are a lot of people who are being left out by these reforms and by China's kind of, fast-paced race towards becoming a rich, powerful country. And these people have hopes and expectations of a better life, but they can realize those hopes and dreams elsewhere, and notably in peaceful places like Zambia, which are offering them the opportunities that China can't.
That China can't. Before I ask Grieve Cheloa's reaction, let's show that excerpt that Nicolas was talking about, the tension palpable at the market in Lusaka, the capital, where Zambian chicken farmers say they just can't compete.
The Chinese businesses are present in a lot of sectors. They're everywhere. We need an economy that protects some of the sectors, for the local people.
They said that what challenges do you have with the Chinese? Yeah.
These Chinese, they like bringing chicken on the market. Even if they are not ready, they just bring. And they sell at a cheaper price. Okay? So you find that us Zambians, we are even failing to keep our chicken. Because of that, people are just going to buy Chinese chickens. And what they do, they can even start selling the chickens at even 3 weeks, 4 weeks. And what they do, they boost their chickens.
Too much medicine, the Chinese people.
Zambian chicken is good. After they reach 5 weeks, they start just giving water with feed, no any chemical. But Chinese continuous giving vitamins.
So the infant can't compete with Chinese.
Can't compete. It's cheaper. Your chicken is very expensive. Our chickens, they are big. We are selling at a high price. They are selling at a small price. And we want the Chinese to go.
So you heard it there, Grieve Cheloa, that chicken farmer at the market saying she wants the Chinese to go. Is it unfair competition?
Thanks so much, Francois. It is certainly unfair competition. As you can appreciate, our marketplaces are the places where sort of like our unemployed, the informal sector try to ply their trade. So to have our sort of marketeers compete with Chinese farmers who come with lots of know-how, who can rear chickens at scale, who possibly have some support from the Chinese government, that certainly is unfair competition. And I think the comment that one of the folks that was interviewed said about it's important for our own government here in Zambia to have a type of industrial policy, a type of agricultural policy that protects some of our sort of folks who are unemployed in the informal sector and plying their trade in the marketplaces. So it is certainly an unfair competition.
Yeah, you've preempted my next question, which was, is it the fault of the Chinese or is it the fault of the Zambian authorities for not establishing and enforcing rules?
I think this is agricultural policy in Zambia is a remit of the Zambian government. And what I think is really useful to understand is that there's been some movement insofar as some circumscribing what Chinese farmers can and cannot do in markets. Certainly more needs to be done, but it's a whole different ballgame from what it was 10 years ago. So to answer your question, certainly it is a remit of the Zambian government.
Do you agree, Solange Guillot-Chatelain?
No, I would have to jump in here because the Chinese chicken farmers in Zambia has become a trope that has been appropriated by Western media outlets and has been a story that has been used to kind of illustrate a bigger phenomenon, which is, the Chinese relentlessly coming in and snatching up local markets. And I know because I myself have written and covered this story for global media, corporations, Western and other, Al Jazeera, for example. And first of all, it would have been good to have actually backed this up with evidence. I've spent months, if not years, in Chinese chicken farms, and they have no connection whatsoever with the Chinese state. More importantly, they have no connection to Chinese credit lines, which is essentially what farmers need to really scale. You can farm at a local level quite cheaply, keeping your costs down and scaling up. But, if you want to move, from a small, medium-sized farm to a larger enterprise, you need a lot of capital injection, which most of these farmers don't have. So there is no connection to the Chinese state when it comes to these very, very local grassroots farmers. And there is no injection of hormones or poison or what have you. These are all myths. And I have spent years, as I said, I have gone to almost every single Chinese chicken farmers there was in and around Lusaka. I know exactly where that was filmed. I've gone to almost all the major chicken markets at 3 in the morning, at 6 in the morning. So the first things are first is, and this is the big problem with the China story, is that everyone tells the story without the facts.
Can I just say something?
Picking up a couple of sound bites is very important.
We don't say in the documentary that the Chinese state
the facts to go with the story.
No, we don't. In the documentary, we don't say that the Chinese state is supporting the Chinese farmers. We don't say that. And what's also interesting is that the Zambian government actually 5 years ago it passed a new law banning foreigners from selling chickens in the markets. But what these people say is that even though they're not present on the market, they're still controlling a lot of the networks. That's what the Zambian farmers, marketeers are saying.
Yeah, absolutely. What I want to do is maybe just move away from kind of these narrative destroying tropes, which is like the Chinese are coming in and doing everything on a very passive kind of African canvas. That's not true. As you were saying, I think African markets have reacted, Zambian markets have reacted very intelligently and put in very specific protectionist measures. So, for example, 2 of the major chicken trading hubs, because we're on the chicken story, were on the Tuesday 2 markets where Chinese are really present are the Tuesday market and, Soweto market. And the way these 2 markets reacted to the Chinese, aggressive marketing of their produce. On one hand, they said, on the Tuesday market, you cannot sell or produce or trade anything that our local producers can do. So you cannot sell potatoes, you cannot sell tomatoes, you cannot sell cabbage. And that actually pushed, this was in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and that pushed a whole group of Chinese farmers to go and diversify their agricultural produce. And the Chinese started farming mushrooms, they started producing tofu, and all these new agricultural products started to come onto these markets. And it completely changed the structure and what was on offer. And then the Soweto market, where specifically where the chickens are being sold, what they were told, what the Chinese chicken seller was told, you cannot come in here after sunrise. You can come and sell, but before sunrise. So they were in the markets generally between 3 to 6, and it takes about an hour to clear your cages and to move out of the market. So they were there during that window. And that was so that, when the sun rises, the Zambian traders who don't have the means to compete effectively, in a market environment could come and then sell their chickens at whatever rate they wanted to. So in these 2 instances, you had very localized, very intelligent reactions by what we call the market authorities, very local, who try to deal with this. The bigger story, of course, is what do we do when liberal economic and political systems penetrate parts of the world that used to be, let's say, peripheral or averse to them, and that is the story behind this China-Zambia, China-Africa. That is the story.
Yeah, that is definitely the story. Grief Chelua, I hope if that our viewers will watch the documentary in full, because what you have, let's put race aside for 1 second, is a story of capitalism, isn't it? Those who have the means and those who don't. How much of this is about China and how much of this is just about unbridled capitalism?
That's an interesting question. Certainly, China, ever since Chairman Mao passed on and Deng Xiaoping took over, has certainly become much more capitalist, right? And certainly, China is really just continuing that age-old quest of sort of exploitation by capitalism. So some of that is certainly that. China is trying to grow. China is trying to flex its muscles. China is trying to be an economic power. And the story of capitalism is to exploit. And that's certainly, there's aspects of exploitation, certainly in this kind of relationship. That's what I would say. And I just wanted to say a few words to Solange. Certainly, the issue here is it might have been a sort of a misstatement on my part to say the Chinese farmers certainly have state support. But what is certainly true is that they're ultra competitive. And I think some of the stuff that she said at the end really confirms what I had said earlier, that there have been movements on agriculture policy, which is the remit of the Zambian government. The Zambian government has moved, and some of the things that she talks about in sort of like suspending days in which the farmers can sell, but there's still farmers who are selling chicken. But the point is to say part of that, there's issues of a trope and there's issue of reality. The reality is that our marketeers were feeling threatened by this, and I think there's movements towards rectifying that.
Nicolas Germain, you didn't visit a chicken farm, but you did visit
a pig farm.
Pig farm. What was there the sense that it had the full weight of Beijing behind it?
No. I wouldn't say that. But I noticed there's a lot of, because before going there, I thought, yeah, you often read in some articles that the Chinese state is behind all these Chinese immigrants in Africa. But what we discovered was no. In fact, there are many people who just simply wanted better lives, wanted less pollution, less overcrowding. And this pig farmer, for example, he didn't have any state support, but he was very ambitious. Like he had 300 pigs, and he told us that next year he wants 3,000. So, as you say, a capitalist.
We've been getting a lot of reactions on the hashtag F24 debate. I'll read this one to you, Grieve. It's from Ruth. China isn't in Africa for altruistic reasons, but then Western nations could all teach master classes in that kind of exploitation. Your thoughts?
I agree completely. I agree completely that the history of Africa's interaction with the rest of the world has been up until this day one of exploitation. But the Chinese one is certainly different. I think that's what's really important to state here. I mean, Africa during the colonial period, the exploitation, the transfer of surplus to the core, to use Solange's terms, the transfer of surplus to the north is not without debate. It's undebatable. But certainly for many people in this part of the world, there's an exploitation, but it is one that seems less in magnitude to the ones that have come before. And it's and for many, it's a hopeful moment. But certainly it's true. China is not doing this because they care about us. They're doing this because they have to grow, they have to become a superpower. But the hope is that our interaction with an outside power for the first time can be beneficial to us. That really is the hope here.
We're going to pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's a special edition of the France 24 debate. We're looking at France 24's documentary, Zambia Under Chinese Influence. It's produced by Nicolas Germain, Yi Song, and Romeo Langlois. Nicolas is with us. Nicolas, there's a long format that's coming out of the documentary on France24.com.
So right now you have a 40-minute version online, but in 3 weeks' time there will be a longer version of around 62 minutes.
62 minutes, and that'll be on France24.com. With us as well, Solange Guillot-Chatelain, a scholar at the who is China-Africa researcher at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. The scholar at the New School is Institute on Race and Political Economy, is of course Grieve Cheloa, who just before the break was pondering this issue of exploitation, whether we're talking about new colonialists or is it a win-win partnership. Let's look at your visit, Nicolas, to a tile factory near the capital, Lusaka.
Oh, we just bought this extra land for the future expanding. 2017年的时候呢，开始创立的这个马可波罗瓷砖厂。
Mr. Huang, our CEO, also very good person, is kindly people. That is why I want to work with him, to work for him forever. That is why I'm here. Yeah. they are friendly. They like to learn, but they also forget very fast. It's our material. We got our mine. Here is a gas station. From the coal, we make a gas to heat the towers. Here is the controlling room for the gas station. And there you see the police post. We're built for the community. Here is no police post. That is why the community, the councillor come to us. They say, no, can you assist us build a police post? And our CEO, Mr. Huang, decided, yes, no problem, we'll build one. Even a bit far, we start to make a foundation already for the hospital, for the community also. Yeah. And the school also, after the hospital. Here we're investor, we make some money, but we also considering how the situation for our Zambia people.
So they're building. They've built the police force post. We saw that. Mm-hmm. They're building as well. He says a hospital and then a school.
And they're just a company making tiles and cement bags, but they say that the locals asked them to do this, and that therefore they've accepted to do it.
The locals have asked them to do it. Grieve Chelua, what does that tell you?
I think in many sense it's an interesting snippet of just the general approach of the interaction between Zambia and China, right? I think what's important is to give some bit of historical background. So during the neoliberal era, during this era when the only major economic powers are Western powers, the type of economic policy that was sort of implemented on parts of the African continent, like Zambia, was one of saying, don't worry about things like infrastructure, these things, the market will magically deliver these kinds of things. And China, and really what sort of happened is that when we began to interact with China, it was very clear. China did ask, what exactly is it that you need? And when the second wave of the Chinese coming onto Zambia, which starts about in the early 2000s, it's very clear that we're short of infrastructure. And that's exactly what the Chinese did. They financed infrastructure, they helped build roads, hospitals, power stations, telecommunications, and that kind of stuff. So I'm not so surprised in this particular excerpt that you showed us that the Chinese gentleman is really talking about the needs of the community, right? The community asked for a police station, the community asked for a hospital, and this is what we're going to give them. We're not going to prescribe that which they should have, but we're going, in conversation with them, we're going to sort of decide together what needs to be provided. So I think this is very much illustrative of the general tone of the interaction between Zambia and China over the last 2 decades.
Solange Guillot-Chatelain, is that are the Chinese better at interacting with the community than Western nations?
It's not a question of better, it's about what are their operating logics. Who is doing the talking, to whom and how? Now, this specific snippet is very interesting because we're talking about Chinese investing in the manufacturing sector. Now, traditionally, manufacturing and agriculture are historically, these are non-traditional sectors in which foreign investors, particularly Western investors, invest. They've never been interested in manufacturing. They've never been interested in adding value locally. What they've always historically been interested is going into, securing resources, strategic resources, at the source, extracting that and then bringing that back to the core. And if there was ever any infrastructure that was left in these countries, it was around these what we called extractive corridors to ensure that these resources are coming out. So what the Chinese are doing, and this is what the film shows but does not explain, which is a shame, which I find a really missed opportunity because it looks at agriculture, it looks at manufacturing, but it doesn't contextualize it and tell us, oh, well, actually, these are the sectors that have been neglected: infrastructure, manufacturing, agriculture, because foreign investors were never historically interested, and they're still not interested in these sectors, And if you look at how countries kickstart their industrialization process, of course, it's by using, what they have. They have cheap land, they have cheap labor, et cetera, et cetera. And so the question is, and I think it goes back to what our Zambian speaker was saying, like, what are the industrial policies, what are the national policies that have been identified to capture this capital that's coming in, to capture this foreign technology, to capture this foreign expertise coming in, and how can we then translate that into structural gains, economic and social structural gains to better the lives of our people here locally. And I would like to say this is what's really important to remember looking at this film is that there's a difference between the state, Chinese state interests and Chinese state expansion, geopolitical agendas, which is state-to-state relations, with these private individuals who are really kind of the grassroots story of globalization. And this is what happens when we talk about global China, is that this everything gets mixed up. And I hope that the 62-minute version of the film will be clearer on this issue, because we get everything in one bundle. We get the state, we get the copper mining, we get the chicken farmers, we get the manufacturing. But at no point are we explained that these are different, very different dimensions of the China story. It's a bit like oil and water.
Is there any difference between the tile factory we just saw in Zambia and the Peugeot car factory that I visited 25 years ago in Nigeria? I mean, it's the same thing. It's transforming things and selling them for the local market. And there too, Peugeot, the local Peugeot, I remember visiting, they funded a local health clinic. Is it any different?
I think what we're looking at right now is that the Chinese are much more they're at low end. That's a low value transfer of technology. The ones in the film, I'm saying, right? The tiles, you cannot compare a tile factory to, a car company like Peugeot. That's much higher up in the value chain. It's much more, it's heavy kind of technology transfer going on where you're training local engineers, etc. So I think, it's a slightly different kind of technology transfer. But I do think that the bigger story, which is what I said earlier on, which is essentially, the redistribution of markets, market systems to places that were traditionally peripheral. So if this is a story about how do, weak economies or, non-capitalistic economies, traditionally speaking, like China, like Zambia, which are very, very similar, how do they handle deregulation, privatization, liberalization? What are the strategies? What are the safeguards that are put in place so that these companies can navigate liberalization in a context of the 21st century in an efficient way? I think that's where the onus should be. We kind of have an idea of what China wants. We kind of have an idea what the French or the British or the Americans or the Australians and the Canadians wanted, in the extractive tech. The question is, what do the Zambians want? That's what my question is. What do Africans want? What are their visions, and how are they putting in place measures to get to that goal? Which leads us to the political question. It's the elections coming up in Zambia. Who's the leader? What is the leader going to do about it?
But just to say, obviously, I disagree a bit with what she said, because in our documentary, we actually show precisely that there are small Chinese investors like the pig farmer. We show that there are big private investors like the guy making the tiles. And then we show that we go to the free trade area, the ZCCZ, which has invested in copper mines, and that's the Chinese state. So we're actually showing that it's not one story. That's exactly the whole point of the documentary.
Grief Chelwa, let me ask you, a job
there's no context. There's no context. If you know, you will know. But there's no...
The economists, the historians talking, there's file footage.
The viewer doesn't have they don't have any tools to be able to identify the difference and to see the outline.
Let me ask Grief Chelwa.
And it's great images. It's great images, great stories. But it could have been told in a more helpful way, instructive way for the viewer, so he doesn't get more confused.
All right, Grief Chelwa, I want to ask you: is there a difference between, if you're a Zambian, between having a Chinese employer, a British employer, a French employer, or a Zambian employer?
I think no. I mean, the phenotype or the nationality of the employer doesn't matter. What's really important is what exactly they're doing. I think that's what really matters from the point of view of Zambians. And I think to answer Solange's question, might have been rhetorical, but I'll hazard an answer here. What do Zambians want? What we want is development. What we want is infrastructure. What we want are good jobs. What we want is good hospitals. What we want is reliable electricity supply. What we want is telecommunications. And in many of those sectors, the Chinese have been rather helpful. So, Francois, there's no difference whatsoever. What's really important is what is the Chinese doing? What are the French doing? What are the Zambians doing? I think at the end of the day, if it is a factory, is that person offering a good job? Are they paying a living wage? Are they following the country's local labor legislations? And if they are foreign, are they also adhering to the country's anti-discrimination laws, anti-racism laws? I think that is what is important.
All right, and I think it's a nuanced picture we see in the report that we saw. I only saw the 40-minute version, not the 62-minute version, which isn't out yet. And Solange making that important distinction there between what's happening at the microeconomic level and what's happening between nation states and superpowers. And there is still that scramble for raw materials. Zambia is Africa's second largest exporter of copper after the Democratic Republic of Congo. Nicolas and the rest of the team went to the Copper Belt and to Zambia's second city, Kitwe. They also spoke to government advisors where there is a sense that, guessing the true size of those exports is somewhere between a science and a dark art.
We don't have any figures in the mining industry. It's crazy. It's crazy, just like that. Nobody. Why? Mines are very secretive. There is what is known as Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, but it's all lies. Yeah, it's all lies.
What is the government doing?
Do you know how they do it? I go and take a sample to government. This is the copper ore I'm exporting. Then there's less copper content than what. Then what goes, nobody checks it.
So, Grief Chelua, as Solange was saying, this it brings us to the topic of there's a presidential election on the way in August. Is the Zambian government being had, not just by the Chinese, but by everybody? How much do we know is being exported? How transparent are those extractive industries?
I think that's an important point, and I think the gentleman whose excerpt you just showed makes an important point. I think there's a need for a lot of transparency in our copper sector. As you know, copper is a very emotive issue in Zambia. And ever since we privatized the mines in the early 2000s, there's been a glaring lack of transparency. And by the way, what's important to note is that our copper industry is not entirely, certainly in the hands of the Chinese. Most of our biggest copper mines, until quite recently when we sort of quote-unquote nationalized too, but before that, most of our biggest copper mines were in the hands of Western companies, right? Canadian companies, Glencore, the Swiss company, and these are the ones that have been the biggest culprits insofar as Spirit and Away copper is concerned. So I think the general point certainly is that we need to increase the capacity of our revenue authority, whose capacity was really destroyed during the sort of the high point of the neoliberal era in the 80s and 90s, whose capacity was really rolled back. We need to grow the capacity of the Zambian state, the capacity of our revenue authority. We need to capacitate them in such a way that they can potentially trace what exactly is coming out of the ground and what is being exported. And the two recent moves by the Zambian government to take over two mines is what one may consider a solution to this problem of opacity. So I think it's certainly true. I mean, we really, really need to, the gentleman is right, that we need to increase our capacity for monitoring exactly what's being exported.
Solange Guillot-Chatelain, you agree that Zambia's tried privatization and maybe it's time to roll it back?
No, I think the main issue is, Zambians are not, or, Zambian actors, whether they're state actors or private actors, are not operating on a level playing field. There's a reason why, mining, which is a really capital-intensive industry, it's a very dirty, notoriously opaque sector. There's a reason why it lacks transparency, and that's because the major operators, have no interest in making these things transparent. And essentially what happened, in the 1990s, during the shock therapy Washington consensus, was that all the major actors who could negotiate on Zambia's behalf, the trade unions, for example, the state that had a larger say in what was happening in the mines, all these different civil society organizations, they were just completely destroyed, either dissolved or reduced or sidelined. And, it was just free rein for, naked capital to come in with naked profit-driven ambition, big money from Western hedge funds, private capital coming in to, pick up all the pieces, And whenever the Zambian government has tried to renegotiate a better deal for itself, in terms of taxing this huge revenue of these, copper being exported out of the country, they're basically told, if you cause too much trouble, we're going to pull out. And we're going to give you more trouble than you need. And that's the problem. The problem is that right from the beginning, since independence, Zambia has not been able to generate surplus wealth, through its own productive capacities, and dictated on its own terms. Even the extractive infrastructure that Zambia had at independence is inherited, its colonial legacy, and the extractive sector was targeted to, the corridors were going from Zambia straight to the UK and not to any other parts of the world, which is why when China came in and then built the Tazara, it's very important because those are two visions that are clashing. China had a pan-African vision of Africa, which is why it could see beyond the Zambian borders, which were the British borders, or British colonial Africa, Southern Africa, and link Zambia to the east coast of Tanzania because China understood the pan-African vision. Whereas I think Europe, even today, still has a very regional, nationally interested understanding of Africa. And I think that's where, China and
right.
foreign countries are operating in very different ways.
Nicolas Germain, when you went and visited the copper mines there, you spoke with trade unionists. Did you get a sense of the balance of power, or should I say the mismatch between workers and the owners?
So what the trade unions were saying is that the situation has improved with the Chinese mines over the last 10 years, but it's not ideal. In their words, they're saying that the wages are lower than in Western companies and the security situation is not as good. That's what the trade union was saying. But they were also saying that there had been an improvement over the last 10 years. But what was interesting also when we went to see the Chinese copper mine, which is where there's a representative of the Chinese state, he was telling us that the copper was not all exported to China. And he was very keen to tell us, for example, that he was selling a lot of his copper to French companies.
All right. Grief Chelwa, before we go, you talked about the need for increased transparency and the need for the cash to go to state coffers, particularly since Zambia became the first nation since COVID to default on its debt. That was back in November. And the criticism is leveled there at China for not being too good at excusing debt. Your thoughts on is the problem again with the creditors or with the state for borrowing money it couldn't pay back?
I think first, the first important point to clarify there is I think it seems to me when I look at the evidence that actually Chinese lenders have been much more willing to reschedule debt, to restructure debt than the Western creditors. By the way, it is worth sharing with your viewers that the majority of our external debt is actually not owed to the Chinese, but it's actually owed to Western banks, Western hedge funds, the IMF, the World Bank, Western bilateral countries, and that kind of stuff. And that it has been the Chinese that have been willing to come to the party insofar as having a discussion about rescheduling debt and restructuring debt. Now, whose fault is it that we find ourselves in this position? What's certainly true is that we really needed this capital. We needed this capital to catch up infrastructure-wise, right? I just told you earlier on that we're lagging behind insofar as vital infrastructure is concerned. And infrastructure is a lifeblood of an economy, right? So whose fault is it? I think lots of people are to blame here. We didn't foresee, that there would be COVID. Nobody foresaw, for example, that we'll be getting out of a commodity super cycle where prices will tank. So there's many, many people to blame for this. But I think, again, it's the remit of the Zambian government to forge a way forward. We really need to have a plan for restructuring our debt. We really need to have agency in this plan, and we really need to drive the process. That's what I would say.
All right, and it's a conversation we will revisit as we grow closer to that August election date. Grief Chelwa, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Lusaka. Solange Guyot-Chatelain in Brussels, Nicolas Germain here in the studio. If you want to watch it, that documentary, you can see it in full on our website, france24.com.